Chronicles of Araxx, Forever Broken. Chapter 1. The floor was cold, and hard as ice. It hurt to sit on, but Analea had sat on it for so long that she no longer felt the pain nor the cold. She sat on the floor in her dirty rags, clothes that were too big for her, ripped and tattered. Her feet were bare, and the grime that covered her was from years of being imprisoned. The walls that surrounded her were grey. The floor was grey. Everything in Analea's cell was grey. The only bright colour she saw in her life was red. Two things Analea saw every day were red. The first was her hair. Her matted, messed up hair. Her guards kept it short, cutting it whenever it grew beneath her shoulders. The other thing Analea saw every day that was red was blood, whether it was her own from the beatings, or that of the many rats that made their way into her cell. Analea could always count on seeing red every day. Squeaking from the other side of the cell caught Analea's attention. She lifted her head from her knees and looked towards the sound. A single solitary rat ran across the floor, its sharp claws scratching on the ground as it chased a large spider over the stone floor. It crossed over the room, escaped through a crack on the other side, followed by the rat, although the rat did not get through the gap as easily as the spider. It escaped the prison, something Analea had attempted to do. All attempts had failed. Even the rats didn't stop to look twice at the small girl. A cold breeze blew across the room, causing the hair on Analea's arm to stand on end. The air smelled fresh and cool, like freedom and dreams. Analea stood from her seated position on the ground and walked over to the far wall. She placed her hand on the cold stone and looked up. On this wall was a window, a small, barred window high up. It was close to the ceiling of the cell, level with the ground outside, and Analea had to stand on her tiptoes to look through it. The sky was black. Few stars were visible from where she stood, but no moon in the sky that night. It had been 3 days since they brought her any real amount of food, and she was feeling weak from it. The cycles of the sun and the moon were the only way of telling how long she'd been in the cell. There were the guards too. Sometimes they would talk when they were outside her room. Every now and then, Analea would catch a date or a time. It was pretty meaningless to her, though. What did time matter when she had nothing to look forward to except her next beating? Loud footsteps sounded. Someone was walking down the corridor. Analea moved to the back wall, the furthest from the door. She knew the drill by now. If she stood at the back of the room, with her head down, the guards were likely to leave her alone. Of course, this depended entirely on which guard was coming. If it was Cain or Jacob, she wouldn't get away without a beating. A few of the others found joy in hitting her, although she never took the time to remember their names. She hoped it would be one of the new guards. They left her alone, almost as if they were frightened of her. Footsteps meant a few things, either another beating or food. Analea hoped it would be the latter. Her stomach growled loudly and angrily. She definitely hoped it would be food. Analea listened carefully to the footsteps. Heavy boots on the stone floor of the corridor echoed in the silence. They did not sound familiar, which was a blessing, or Analea hoped it would be. The new guards were always too scared to get close to her. Analea had gotten good at learning which footsteps belonged to which guard, and which ones to be wary of. The guard who was already standing at her door greeted the newcomer. The sound of the heavy wooden door unlocking was loud and in the echoing silence of her cell. The door opened with a loud creak, the light from the corridor filling the gap, silhouetting the man in the doorway. The man who was bringing her food. She could smell it as soon as the door opened. Analea allowed herself to smile a little. I don't know why Cain keeps you alive, why he keeps you fed, but here you go. The guard threw the food at the floor. The plate clattered as it hit the ground, spilling some of the contents. Analea's stomach complained at the waste, but she kept still, not wanting to move just yet. She did not know the guard, and for all she knew, one move could mean a beating and the food being taken away. She did not want to risk that. Analea waited until the guard had left the room before she lifted her head to collect the scraps. An old stale bread bun and the bones from what looked like lamb chops. They still had a little meat on them. Analea ate greedily, savouring every mouthful, every taste like it was the last thing she would eat. One of these days it could well be. Silence once again fell in Annalea's cell as she returned to the place where she usually sat. She sat on her haunches, the bone in her mouth, as she stared at the window to the world outside. The taste of the meat boosted her mood, and even though the meat was cold and had a greasy texture, it was the nicest thing she'd eaten in a long time. She'd been living in that cell so long she'd almost forgotten what the outside looked like. From what she could deduct, Annalea determined that she'd been captive for about 9 years, and in that cell for the last 4. She was 7 when she was taken from her home, so that would make her 16, perhaps nearly 17. She did not remember much of when she was taken. All that she remembered was fire, burning and death, then waking up in the castle. She imagined it to be a castle, although she did not remember ever seeing the outside. The walls reminded her of castles she'd seen in films before she was taken, although there was no Prince Charming coming to save her. The reason for Annalea being taken and kept prisoner was unclear to her. She'd been taken from her home by a man called Cain, although she had no idea why, although there must be a reason. When she was first taken, Cain did the questioning himself. Where was it? But Annalea didn't know what he was looking for. Cain told her that his parents hid something and that it was his. He wanted it back, and Annalea would have to find it for him. But even he seemed to not know what he was looking for. The beatings happened a few weeks after the questioning. When Annalea couldn't answer Cain's questions, he became angry. The angrier he got, the more he hit her. Eventually he gave up, leaving her to his guards. They beat her, made fun of her, tortured her, and from what Annalea could see, there was no reason for it. The questioning had stopped years ago. They beat her until she was bloody and unconscious, throw her in her cell, then do it again the next day. Annalea was thankful when this routine finished, but they still did not let her go. Every once in a while, Cain would come back, and Annalea would get a frightful beating. But it had been weeks since this had happened last. Many times she wished for freedom, but it never came. Annalea searched many times for a way out of her prison, but there was no way she could find. After years of wishing she was free, wishing her parents would come back to save her, she gave up. Instead, she simply wished that it would all end soon. Maybe one day a guard would hit her hard enough and she would die there and then, or they'd forget to feed her for a couple of weeks, but that never happened. Annalea laid down eventually on the cold, hard ground. She'd been given an old dog bed by one of the newer guards. He felt sorry for Annalea and pitied her. The dog bed smelled old and damp, but it was better than sleeping on the floor. She found the most comfortable spot on the dog bed and curled up against the cold. Darkness took over within time. That night she slept with a full belly, as full as possible for someone trapped in perpetual starvation. Annalea found herself in a house. It was beautiful, with old wooden beams on the ceiling and pretty bricks surrounding an old fireplace. The walls were a warm cream colour, and there were flowers in a vase on the mantelpiece. There was a painting above the fireplace of the family that lived in this house. Annalea could see herself in the painting. The bright red hair of a small child gave it away. She was smiling, the happy child that Annalea had once been. The other people in the painting must have been her parents, although she could not remember them clearly, and the faces were not in focus. It was as though someone had painted over the faces to cover them. She could see their bodies, holding her in the picture. The man had short brown hair, and the woman had long straight red hair like her, but the faces were unclear. Annalea focused on them, but the more she focused, the blurrier they became. Annalea looked over to the window, a large bay window with pale brown curtains framing it. She could see the grass and trees outside. It looked as though the house was in a forest, or at least not the city. The sky outside was orange too. It must have been sunset. It looked beautiful out there, and Annalea wanted nothing more than to play outside. A voice from behind her brought happiness, although she couldn't quite make out what it was saying. The voice was muffled and sounded as though it was underwater. The woman the voice belonged to moved quickly towards Annalea, who assumed that it was her mother by the red hair, picking her up and held her tight, too tight. It hurt, but the hold her mother had on her was familiar. She breathed in deep, and a familiar smell filled her nostrils, the smell of roses and oranges. It smelled like her mother, like home. It made her woozy and light-headed. Although Analea could not hear what the woman was saying clearly, she could tell the words were said in panic and fear. The woman moved quickly with Analea in her arms, but the fire was quicker. Analea had not noticed the blaze burning around her, but the orange glow filled the house. Smoke filled the space above her head, and Analea began to cough on the smog. The woman ran with her in her arms, out of the door and down the cobbled path. She smelled nice, sweet and familiar, but the smell was short-lived, soon replaced by smoke and burning. Analea peeked over the woman's shoulder, through the tangle of hair that cascaded down her mother's back. What she saw was the house she had grown up in ablaze. The windows were shattered and the flames were climbing higher, burning her home to the ground. The thatched roof had caught quickly, and soon there would be nothing left. She reached a hand out towards the building to stop the flames, but nothing happened. Why was her home burning? Why was this woman running with her in her arms? And who were all the strange people that surrounded them? She hadn't noticed these people before, distracted by everything else. It was as though they had just arrived in the garden. The thought crossed Analea's mind that the people might have been there to help tackle the blaze, but the looks on their faces changed her mind. Their faces were twisted into angry snarls. They did not look human. Analea's mother, the woman who was running for her life with a small red-headed child, version of Analea, tripped on something in the ground. She fell fast and dropped her at the same time. She instinctively reached out for her fallen daughter, but one of the men surrounding them grabbed her. She picked her up by the throat. Analea called out the only word she could bring to her lips, "Mother." But it was too late. The man squeezed tight. Analea's mother struggled against the force, but the man was too strong. She grew weaker but struggled against the man. Analea stood from the ground, aware of the pain in her legs, burning on her arms, and the tears clouding her vision. She briefly looked down at herself, seeing scuffed knees and a burnt right arm. She focused herself and attempted to charge the man strangling her mother, but someone picked her up before she could get to her. Analea was small, and the man picked her up as though she was a rag doll. The big man squeezed every ounce of life out of her mother, then dropped to the ground, lifeless and cold. Analea stared into the wide dead eyes of her mother, still open and looking right at her. But there was something wrong. The face was twisted, it didn't look human. She screamed in terror, but her voice was silent. "What do we do with the child?" a clear voice asked. Analea could not say anything. She saw her mother die, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Boss wants her alive," another said. The man comes into view, blocking Analea's mother from sight. "What's this?" he asked as he took Analea's burnt arm in his hand. "Looks like she was burnt in the fire, sir," the man holding her answered. "Well, I guess the boss didn't say anything about not hurting her." He squeezed the burn on Analea's arm again. The pain was excruciating. She cried out. He only wanted her alive. The man then brought up a hand and bunched it into a fist. With full force he punched Analea in the face. She winced in pain. Awoken with a deep breath and a pain in her arm, Analea looked around. The dream was over. She was once again in the present. It was not a dream really, it felt more like real life. It was a memory, clouded and blurred, but clear as day at the same time. She looked down at her arm. The burn scar she held there throbbed a little. It no longer hurt, but would be forever a reminder that she lost her mother in a fire caused by the man who held her prisoner. Analea had this dream many times. Almost every time she dreamed, it was the one where she lost her mother. She could never see her face, nor that of her father's, and it haunted her. Why could she not remember the faces of the people that brought her up? Why could she not hear her mother's voice clearly? And why did she not know what happened to her father? Darkness still surrounded Analea, but she was far too awake to sleep again. She stood from her makeshift bed, rubbed her sore back, and made her way over to the bars on the wall that led to the outside world. She climbed up the wall, using small footholds to get up, then used the ledge to hold on to. Her arms were strained to keep her there, but Analea was determined to finish the job. For weeks earlier, Analea had been working on loosening the bars. There were 6 in total, and so far 4 of them were loose enough to push free from the concrete slots. Analea was determined to be free from her prison, but it was taking a lot of work. This was not in fact the first cell she had been prisoner in. In fact, Analea could not remember how many cells she'd been captive in. It must have been in the double figures. She had escaped a couple of times, using weakness of the doors or managing to get around new members of the guard team who had not been told about her thoroughly, but this cell proved to be harder to escape from. It had been several months' worth of strength training for Analea to be able to hold her own body weight for long enough to work on the bars. She had been twisting, pulling and pushing the bars, loosening them from their fixtures. Then she would put them back in their rightful places so none of the guards would suspect anything when they scrutinised her cell. Since she had escaped the last time, using a small drain in her cell to escape to the sewers below, the guards kept much more of a close eye on her. They assumed, however, that the bars at the windows were too high up to be an escape risk. How wrong they would be. The bar Analea had been working on for the last hour or so came free. That one had been the easiest so far, with the others normally taking a few hours or more. It might be enough, Analea muttered to herself. She couldn't risk escaping yet, though. The sun was peaking on the horizon, and there would be a change of guards soon. She needed to wait until nightfall again, just after the guards had been changed. That way she would guarantee that no one would check on her for a good few hours, which would give her enough time to make a break for it. Analea looked over the land as it stretched from her cell, a clear break to the tree line about half a mile away. If she could get there, she might have a chance. Her first chance at hope in a long time. She looked up at the sky. Birds were chirping from somewhere, although Analea could not see where from. Analea allowed herself to drop down from the wall, landing with a soft thud on the ground. It sent shooting pains up her legs from the impact, but she soon recovered from that. The sound of approaching footsteps and voices indicated that the guard change was due. She walked softly over to the door to get a better place for listening to their conversation. During the handover, sometimes Analea would grasp at useful information. It was in these short space of time that she would hear of the outside world she could no longer remember. She would also find out if she was to be questioned that day or not. "Are you asleep on your feet, boy?" the approaching guard asked. From the noise and shuffling outside, it would seem that Analea's night guard had fallen asleep on duty. "Sorry, sir," he said firmly as he snapped to attention. "No need to be sorry. I'm not going to tell anyone you fell asleep," the second guard said. "Quiet last night, I take it?" "I didn't hear a sound from inside," Sleepy said. "She's often quiet." The first guard put something on the ground. The metal clang gave it away. It sounded like a bowl, maybe. Analea hoped it would be more food for her. The thought made her stomach grumble. "Can I ask you something, sir?" "Go for it, lad." Why does the boss keep her locked up? What good is she to him?" he asked. It was the very question on Analea's lips. "Truth is, I don't really know," the other guard answered. "We've had her locked up for so long now, I think the only person who remembers why is the boss. He still has to ask her where it is, but none of us know what it is. And I'm not sure she does either." He paused before he continued. "Do me a favour, lad, before you clock off." "Yes, sir." "Take this into her. The boss will be in late today. The kid will need her strength." With that, the door to Analea's cell opened. She stepped back away from it and looked at the man standing in front of her with a bowl of hot soup. Her mouth instantly started watering, and the aroma that came from the soup made her stomach growl audibly. She looked at the man holding the bowl, waiting for him to put it down. He couldn't be any older than her, and looked terrified. Why would he have been so scared of Analea? She was a tiny thing, no muscle, and weak. Or that was what everyone thought. Analea's oversized baggy clothes hid a toned body, and although she was underweight, she was strong for her size. The man was visibly shaking as he stood in front of her. Analea could not help but think how easy this man, no, boy, would be to overpower. She could rush him, and no doubt he would drop the bowl and let her escape. If it weren't for the second guard now in the corridor, she might have seriously considered it. Instead, Analea simply stood in her cell, keeping her head low but her eyes on the door. The young man put the bowl of soup on the ground and closed the door again. Analea took up the bowl and drank. It was hot, but a pleasant feeling after the cold meat and stale bread the night before. The guard change was over and Analea was tired. She would rest for now, but not sleep. If Kane was coming later, she'd need to be awake. The bars were not ready for her to escape, and she would not fit through the gap as it was. Analea prayed that the guards were wrong, and that Cain was not on his way to see her. So that was Chronicles of Araxx, Forever Broken, Chapter 1. I am going to leave a link down in the description below for book number 1. It is free on Amazon. Book number 2 is $2.99, and book number 3 is currently being written. I hope you enjoyed this reading, and depending how well this goes down, I may do another reading from this book or from one of my others. So thank you very much for watching, and for now, from me,